So it's been a while since we were able to kind of engage. A couple of things going on that caught my attention. In the interim, there are a few issues that I wanted to speak to. The Supreme Court's been busy. There have been some issues that come down. NIL, which is kind of hot right now, name, image, likeness. A decision that came down that allows athletes to exploit their own name, image, to brand it and essentially make money from that. As a result of that decision, Reggie Bush got his Heisman Trophy back because of an infraction that he had made in this same vein. I remember the Bannon brothers some years ago who first kind of started this. So to see it come to fruition, that was interesting. In addition to that, there were decisions handed down surrounding prosecutorial misconduct where defendants were unfairly treated, unfairly prosecuted. The court decided not to go back and revisit those. In other words, you cannot, there's no reciprocity. You cannot go back and argue and have these other cases from past overturned. We can't do that. So going forward, that is going to be applicable. And then Justice John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts, continued his 35-year assault on voting rights, where he has really been, it seems, just an enemy of the people, for want of a better word, in that he's allowing states more authority in determining how voting takes place. Of course, the inconsistency across the states throughout the country is what necessitated the Voting Rights Act in the first place. And at that time, he was clerking for the Supreme Court and wrote a very strong opinion against voting rights then. So this has been kind of a bee in his bonnet, for want of a better word, going forward. And the decision that came down about allowing states to marshal their authority around voting kind of sounded like the justices were drinking the critical race theory Kool-Aid. And then last but not least, and finally this happened. It happened again. I'm not saying that it happened for the first time. It's actually happened several times in the past few years, where in the state of Mississippi, 2 black valedictorians who had the highest grade point averages in their class were forced to share that award with white students with lower grade point averages because parents became angry and made a case of it. And again, I said, it's not strange. It's happened several times. I know those issues seem like they're all over the place, but they're actually connected. Here's the thing. And the person who kind of brought the ideas together is Dr. James Donor. Now, he's a professor of education at the College of William and Mary. And he has a term for it. I'm not so keen on the term, but I understand the concept. He calls it white fragility. White fragility. In other words, it's where the white majority has kind of maintained this power, this privilege for so long, and that grip seems to be loosening, and it creates a state of anxiety in that population, which causes them to act out in different scenarios. So the issues we're looking at today fall into these 3 different categories, but the reason that they're consistent is that they really speak to this idea that these are places and issues where there has been a distinct advantage for the majority, and that seems to be falling away. For instance, if we look at the categories we've talked about today, the perception of dominance in sports, in education, and in politics. Now, I know people think, well, how has there been a dominance in sports of the white majority? Because every athlete you see who's getting an endorsement, who's on TV, who has some kind of fame, 80% of the NBA is black, 70% of the National Football League is black or people of color, and of course baseball, it's not predominantly black, but it is predominantly people of color and non-Hispanics. And so to say that there's a dominance by the white majority in those sports seems to be misplaced. However, what we're talking about in sports is not the product. It's not the product. You understand? Because all the people we just mentioned are the product. No, what we're talking about is that dominance takes place in the opportunities in ownership, opportunities in management, and opportunities in coaching. So all of these guys you see signing multi-million-dollar, $100 million contracts, whatever we might think of them, they're still just a product, and those contracts are only as good as the commitment of ownership. Now, in NIL, that's a concession that seems like it could be meaningful, name, image, likeness, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, and it took 35 years to get here. And so we see that ebb of power flowing from ownership and management to the product, and it's in its early stages, and so it causes some anxiety, and it can be determined that the blowback, the pushback on that idea is a result of the fragility that Dr. Donner is speaking of. In education, well, there are volumes of books that have been written that designate that would argue that African Americans are in some way intellectually inferior. And that was believable at the time because the great institutions in the country, their populations, their graduates were dominated by people who were in the white majority. However, in today's terms, 75% of all the people in the country don't go past a high school diploma. 75%. And so when you get into that smaller 25%, the diversity there is growing, for want of a better word, exponentially. And so there's a greater growth, there's a greater share. And so the eye test might have seen at one time that there was some underrepresentation of minorities, but now it seems in business or in technology, in college, in success, that is beginning to spread out, and the inroads being made by African Americans are significant. The most famous African American in our current memory has a degree from Harvard and was president of the United States. And then in voting, Georgia, for the first time in decades, elected a Jewish man and an African American man to represent them in the Senate in Georgia. So, panic is set in. And things like teaching history and voting and sports have become triggers for a nervous majority. My feeling is it's going to get worse before it gets better. As Richard Manow so often says, watch this space. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But what do I know? I'm just throwing shade. Thanks for your time this morning. I look forward to speaking to you again next week.